Well, Ed Wager, thank you very much for taking the time to share with us some of your memories about your time in the service. When did you go into the Army?
I joined the military after college in June of 1952.
So you joined in June of 52, and that was after college. So about how old were you in 1952?
52, I was right around 22.
Right around 22. And the reason I ask is that you must have some memories, at least about the end of the Second World War.
Yes, in a roundabout way. Of course, having most of my time devoted to education up to that point, and not thinking much about the war other than what I would learn from my uncles who were in the service.
Yeah. Well, do you have any memories of Pearl Harbor? Were you too young to have any memories of Pearl Harbor?
Harbor occurred when I was around 12 years of age.
Okay, yeah.
I can remember the day rather vividly because my brothers and I were actually playing on our front porch outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I was born and raised. And my father had the radio on at the time, and he came out and got us and took us into the house to listen to the information that was coming across regarding Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And it was somewhat dramatic for we youngsters at the time.
Yeah.
And he took time to explain as much as he could about the circumstances. And it proved to be a little scary.
I'll bet. And at that time, did you have any idea where Pearl Harbor was?
Not really.
Did you have any idea where Hawaii was at that time?
I knew geographically approximately where the islands were,
Right.
but it seemed like they were just eons away from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
People who lived through that time tell me that it was a time in American history when the country was absolutely united and that everyone had a feeling of being involved. Even children had a feeling that they were involved and that they would have to sacrifice, not having things to eat that they might normally have, maybe not as many sweets as they might normally have. Rationing, I hear stories about children going door to door to collect metal and things like that for the war effort. Do you have recollections of that sort of thing?
Very much so. And my brother, I was the eldest at that time, had two younger brothers with me. And we, did that very same thing. Old rubber tires, cans, rags, anything that, newspapers. And the big thrill each Saturday would be going with mother to the grocery store with our wagon, and her with her coupon books to determine what she could buy based on the rationing and so on. My father owned a car and did have a coupon book for gasoline. And in fact, I think I might even have that still someplace in my archive.
Wow.
We learned and knew that much about the war, but of course nothing firsthand.
Right. Yeah. So you participated in that sort of thing, going door to door and collecting newspaper, collecting tires and things like that?
I did, and we each had a coupon book, our own, for war stamps that we could buy stamps, and when our coupon book was equated to the value of a war bond, a $25 war bond, then we would turn that in and start another one.
Yeah.
And that was our contribution to the war effort, we felt.
Yeah. So and is that how you thought of it? I'm 12, I'm 13, I'm 14, I can't serve, but I'm still contributing to the war effort. Is that how you thought of it at the time?
Yes, very much so. And of course, when you watch the news, you tended to get a little more connected to what was going on. And of course, some of the scenes that were shown gave a fairly dramatic impression of how dangerous war actually was. And
Yeah.
that, and we felt we were fairly fortunate that we were young enough that we didn't have to participate.
Of course, the major event of World War II was D-Day, and the president, led the country in prayer even on D-Day. Do you have any recollection of that in particular, of the invasion of northern France? That is a fairly specific thing for a young person to notice, but do you have any recollection of that specifically?
No, not really, but flashing forwards a number of years, I eventually visited Normandy in France.
Yeah.
On a guided tour as an adult, and that allowed me to even recollect back to my childhood when actually on the beaches and that area we were watching in newscasts and so on.
Yeah.
And that experience of actually being on Normandy in France was fairly emotional.
I'll bet it was. Especially since you remember this moment that, my sense is that people who remember that time, as difficult as that war was, as horrendous as that war was, it was also, people who lived through that time kind of express the sense that it was also a great moment in the country's history because the country was so united.
It was an experience that took me a while to comprehend that not only the danger, but what was actually going on around the world at that time, and we could be part of it at my age of 12.
Yeah, sure. Wow.
It was a little bit of a challenge to physically connect with it, but you certainly did emotionally.
So then the war ends in 45. So that means at this time now you're what, about 16, something like that, when the war ends?
I was in high school
Yeah.
at that. I went into college in 1948 and then completed my college 4 years later in 52.
Okay. What was your degree?
I had a BS degree in psychology and political science.
Okay.
And a double major.
So you had a college degree and a double major, but you enlisted in the Army, is that right?
Correct.
Why did you choose the enlistment route rather than the officer route, having a degree?
The people that I talked to led me to believe that carrying an AR on my military number, RA, regular Army, might lead to opportunities in the military as opposed to simply carrying a rifle and going into battle. So I chose that if I thought maybe about officer candidate school or some other activity as a enlisted soldier, I might have a better opportunity.
Okay. And you did enlist, you weren't drafted. Yeah. And so what was your motivation for enlisting? You had a college degree. Presumably you could have, gone different ways. What was your motivation for enlisting?
Early, I felt that I not only had a responsibility, but as I mentioned earlier, I had uncles who served in the Second World War. I had uncles who served in the First World War, and some of the stories they revealed as I was growing up in the family, led me to feel that I had a responsibility to the country that was my home. And I thought if I was going to be drafted, I might as well enlist and try and do the best I could, both for myself and the safety of my family.
Sure, yeah. So you were in college when the Korean War broke out then, I'm guessing in June of 1950. Yeah.
Yes.
What do you remember about that? You know, I'm imagining it's big news, although obviously less dramatic than Pearl Harbor, but what do you have any memories at all about sort of the beginning of that war in Korea?
Just the confusion of, first of all, where was Korea?
Mm,
And then why the peninsula was divided, and the attacks that seemed to be unjustified led to more confusion than anything else as to what it was all about.
yeah, yeah. I've heard that a lot from Korea War era veterans, that the first question was, where is Korea? And yeah, what's going on there? So you go in the Army in 1952, and then what does your job in the Army end up being?
Well, like in most all situations, when you enter the service, there's a period of basic training.
Sure.
And I was sent to Indiantown Gap outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, for my basic infantry training. And that was quite an experience for someone just getting out of college, learning how to double time every place you went and then stand in line for 20 minutes.
I guess your drill sergeant was probably a little different from your professors, I'm guessing.
He didn't be different. Yeah, the challenge was, of course, to stay out of his way so that you didn't get your trouble, and never volunteer for anything because it would be a pain in the neck. One of the
That's right. Yeah, what's when you think about your time in basic training, is there any particular memory that sticks out the most?
Well, some of the experiences were quite different.
Right.
That I readily think about was when our company was marched out into a field outside of the main post area, and there was nothing in the field but a long road, and the road, for some reason, had foxholes every 5 yards. Now, of course, is a digging of the ground that a soldier normally does for his own protection. And as we were instructed, each of us got into a foxhole in this road, not understanding what was going on until we heard a tank start up, and we were told to keep our heads down, and this tank literally drove down the road over us.
Wow.
And feeling of looking up and seeing this thunderous machine running right over you was, can still remember it this day.
I'll bet. Yeah. Wow. Now you're in boot camp in 52. Of course, the war is still going. It's going to keep going through July of 53. Did you know when you were in basic training, because your job kept you in the States, that you didn't have to go to Korea itself? Did you know this at the time when you were in basic, that you would not be going to Korea?
Did not, because we all did the same basic training with respect to weaponry and time on the rifle range and being sure that hit the target, which in my case proved to be rather challenging because though I had hunted as a youngster and I had fired weapons, target practice with my uncles, I wasn't afraid of a gun. But when I fired my M1 rifle at a target 50 yards away that was fairly large and couldn't hit it. I just couldn't understand what was going on. And this happened in 3 or 4 successive shots until I called for the sergeant to come and explain why I couldn't hit that side of the building just 50 yards away. He looked at my weapon and he showed me that I had not tightened down my rear sight. So I was never hitting what I was aiming at.
Okay.
After that, I actually shot expert.
Okay, so things went well after that. There are a lot of young people who resist the idea of going into the service because they're afraid of boot camp or basic training. Now, I went through boot camp in the Navy in the late 1980s or the mid 1980s, so it was much more tame than what you experienced. But you know, I tell young people that boot camp is or basic training is one of the best things that can happen to you. Do you agree with that? That as hard as it is, as you're going through it, when you look back on it, it's actually a very formative experience?
I think it was a good experience in my own personal development, having never experienced anything like that.
It's just people yelling at you for no reason.
Yeah, and it mentioned double timing everywhere and then standing in line. I swore that when I got out of the military, I was never going to stand in a line again. Of course,
Yeah. Sure.
we're objected to lines.
Right.
But
That's
the
right.
thing that struck me was the food. Army, coming from my mother's home kitchen, where in theory everything was just delicious. Army food was quite an experience. In many ways, I entered the Army as a very picky eater, and quickly realized that I was miles away from a candy store or any place that I could get anything to eat other than what the Army gave me. And it didn't take me very long to learn how to eat everything in sight.
Give up some of that pickiness. Yeah.
It was, in fact, I came home on leave, and my mother saw me eat as a military man. She couldn't believe how my diet habits and eating habits had changed, that I just ate everything in sight. She brought the Army for me.
Yeah. So after basic, then you go to school. So now you're going to learn your job. Your basic training's done. Now you go to learn your job. So what is your job in the Army then after basic?
When my basic training was completed, we were given told of our assignments, and part of my company was sent to Europe, to the European theater, and part of the company was sent to the Korean area, and about 6 of us were told that we were going to Fort Riley, Kansas, to the Army Intelligence School. About all we were told. Again, there was a brief leave of absence, and I boarded a plane and shipped out to Kansas.
Okay.
The West that I never even knew existed, having never been west of Ohio from Pennsylvania. And now I was on my way to the middle of the United States, not knowing what to expect at all.
Wow. So you're going to be in Army Intelligence. So this isn't something you asked for. It's not something you volunteered for. It's something that was given to you.
And I assume it was because myself and the other fellows were all college students.
Yeah. So, okay. So just basically then, what did your work in Army intelligence involve? And did you serve just one enlistment?
Yes, I did. The service for 2 years.
Oh, okay. So it was a 2-year enlistment then. So about a year and a half then in intelligence and something like that. So what did that job involve?
I was positioned on the main post in the military intelligence school, which of course was similar to my grade school, high school, and college classwork, to study aerial photography analysis. Photo interpretation was my qualification.
Yeah,
A photo interpreter.
sure.
And I went through 12 weeks of training as to how to study maps, how to analyze aerial photography in a special way that involved three-dimension viewing. Aircrafts would take a flight sortie over a territory with special cameras that took stereoptic pictures which slightly overlapped each other. And when they developed, you looked at them, they were actually kind of fuzzy. And until you positioned them under an instrument called a stereoscope, it actually created three-dimension instantly.
Wow.
Trees up and buildings grew up, and you could identify things much easier in three-dimension.
Yeah. So when you're looking at these maps, or at these photographs, what sorts of things are you looking for? Of course, you're going to see mountains and things, or hills and things like that. But what sort of particular things are you most interested in finding?
If you relate it to a military situation, in theory, the photos would be of enemy installations and equipment, and your job was to identify as much of that material and personnel and facilities and buildings and anything that could be of benefit to your side of the battle, to increase knowledge as to what the enemy had.
Sure.
That you need.
Yes, and I imagine this knowledge and this intelligence would be used, for example, to plan future bombing runs or things like that.
Type of engagement to include on-field attacks and as you said, bombing.
Yeah.
During the school program, we would actually be taken on flights in a converted cargo craft to fly over areas and view them with our own eyes. I remember one flight over Kansas City where we were actually pointing out stockyards and rivers and bridges and buildings and populated areas, and then go back the next day in class and actually look at those same areas in photograph 3D, see how dramatically they changed your view of that territory.
We're talking about 1952, 1953 here, when the Cold War is what, as cold or as hot? I mean, it's a very, however you want to say it, cold or hot, time in the Korean War. And of course, Korea is an active fight, but Europe, there's potential trouble in Europe, troubles brewing elsewhere in Southeast Asia. Did you see photographs that came from other parts of the world? Did you analyze photographs that came from Europe, from Asia?
Most of what we initially viewed was related to stateside situations. The availability live material from overseas was somewhat limited, but occasionally we would get actual battle scene viewing that would allow us to experience more readily the real war circumstances during my 12 weeks in class.
Yeah, yeah.
That was limited.
Yeah, but I mean, at any point in your enlistment, when you're out of school, at any point in your enlistment, did you see photos taken from Europe, from Asia?
The part of my enlistment after my schooling, I was asked to remain on the main post. Part of our class also went to Europe and part went to Korea. And a number of us graduates were asked to stay on in the school environment as assistant instructors who worked with teachers who taught the class. And we were kind of their handy people as far as future classes that were concerned.
Sure. Yeah.
I happen to have with me a picture, 42 students that I was part of, and the majority of them left the United States, but I was again one of the ones that stayed put for some reason that I never privileged to know. When I completed my program, I was given a certificate
Right.
proving that I was a qualified photo interpreter. And unfortunately for me, in some respects, I never really had an opportunity to test my skill in the real world because I spent the rest of my enlistment at Fort Riley working in the school system, which was in some respects just like an 8 to 5 job, 5 days a week. And I had a Class A pass on weekends that I could leave the post if I wished. If we went into Manhattan, we were competing with the college students, so you didn't want to wear your uniform. That would sometimes result in some difficult situations.
Oh, is that right? Now, by compete with them, what do you mean by compete with the college students?
If you were in a restaurant or you were in a theater or you were roller rink, of course, there were always college students there too.
Yeah.
So truly to more blend in than to stand out.
Oh, right. Okay. So
We
by
always,
by compete, you made maybe compete for dates and things like that?
we always wore civilian clothes.
Yeah. Huh, that's interesting. Now I also have a photo here of a football team, and I think you're number 58. Is that what is the story behind that photo?
Was again part of my interest in sports, which I grew up playing, and I learned rather quickly that all of the facilities at the fort, and there was an infantry training division, there was a medical training division, there was the main post where I was, and all those units had sports teams. And there was some advantage to participate in sports in that occasionally your menu was a little better than what the normal cadre was served.
Yeah.
Year round, I volunteered, although I said I should never volunteer for anything. I volunteered to play football, basketball, and softball in season. And that also helped me stretch the time that I was spending, since activity was totally limited to my classroom work and what I could enjoy on weekends.
Yeah. So it sounds like your Army life, with the exception of basic training, it sounds almost like it was an extension of your college career.
I would
Very
say
much focused on education.
pretty accurate. And one of the reasons I was somewhat initially hesitant to even do this interview, because I felt my military experience was rather mundane compared to some of the stories, the horror stories I've heard
Yeah.
about the war.
I think what your story illustrates is that, you know, the military machine is a very big and complicated machine. And, you know, if you're going to have intelligence, if you're going to have soldiers doing the kind of intelligence work that you've described, they're doing it in Europe, they're doing it in Korea, and that's very important work. Somebody has to train them. And so you're part of that. And so even though, as you say, I mean, you're not on the front lines, or you're not, you know, just behind the front lines, you're still playing a role and contributing to the effort. And so that's why I think it's still an important part of the overall program.
I wasn't a shooter, nor was I a cook, but I was a teacher, so to speak,
Yeah.
and contributed in its own way, as you just described.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Are you glad that you spent those 2 years in the Army?
I think it was a tremendous experience in terms of my personal growth, in seeing a phase of life that I never would have seen had I not enlisted in the military.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That I never saw. And here I am living in the state of Kansas, where I spent much of my Army career at the time, never thinking I'd be back here. And I've been here since 1957.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Wig. I really appreciate you taking the time.
And I had the opportunity to visit with you, Preston. Thank you.